Everyone. Good afternoon. It is, yeah, 1 o'clock. So thank you so much to everyone for being joining in on this webinar. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Yeah, this is the Caneberry production webinar we're hosting by Rutgers University. I am Janine Spies. I am with Rutgers Cooperative Extension as the statewide program leader for fruit IPM. We're really lucky to be able to work with commercial fruit growers across the state, and they're mostly blueberry, tree fruit, and wine grape producers, but we work with several growers that produce caneberries. We're seeing increased production, particularly um, in our UPIC diversified farming operations, but also we have some high tunnel, large scale retail production. So yeah, our colleagues at Rutgers, myself, and the IPM team, we really wanted to pull in some expertise in caneberry production and pest management. So I want to introduce and really appreciate Dr. Haley Sater from University of Maryland Extension. She's an ag agent there. She'll be talking about caneberry establishment. Um, Following Haley, we'll have Dr. Kelly Hamby joining us from University of Maryland. She's an associate professor and extension specialist who will be talking about common pests and beneficials in Caneberry. We also have Dr. Matthew Bertucci joining us from University of Arkansas, recently associate professor. He has worked extensively in different sustainable production systems, but he's done some work with weed management, and we'll be talking about some of that ongoing research. And finally, we'll have Dr. Sarah Villani talking from North Carolina State University, assistant professor of plant pathology, and she'll be talking about the caneberry diseases. So um, I want to take it back with some housekeeping notes, particularly if you are interested in receiving pesticide credits. Um, we have recertification credits for licensed holders in New Jersey. You will need to send a photo with your valid photo ID to me in an email. And there will be a form to fill out, an attendance verification form that you'll want to fill out before the end of the session with your last name, first name, pesticide license, and your birth date. So please do that. That information is in the chat. And we ask that if you are receiving pesticide credits or seeking them, we will try to get the, let's see, can I change the video? Don't see that. Um, but we'll keep working on that to see if we can share um, your video. Otherwise, yeah, please fill out that information. So, yeah, without further ado, and if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat as well regarding how to do those pesticide credits. But yeah, any questions or concerns, you could drop that. And then we will be going through the presentations from our specialists, and we will have a session at the end for questions. So we ask that if you could hold your questions or provide them in the chat, that would be great, and we'll make sure that they're addressed. And this session is recorded. We'll be providing that in a follow-up email as well, so you have that for your records. Okay. Yes, so without further ado, I will invite Haley to start us off and talking about caneberry establishment for raspberries and blackberries. So take it away, Haley.
All right. I'm gonna get my screen shared here. Make sure it's sharing the right one. I think it's this. Let's see if, uh-oh. I think I just shared the presenter view. Let's
Yeah, it seems like the
see.
presenter view.
Okay, I think I can switch that. And I'm gonna take down these closed captions. Um, I know there's a way to switch these.
Haley, if you go to the top where it says swap display, like above the timer, hit that. That should work.
Right above the,
The
okay.
arrows. Nope, the arrows. The arrows back and forth.
Oh, swap display.
That
Yep.
should work.
Okay. Uh, Thank you. Perfect. Okay. Um, all right. So I'm going to be talking to you guys about how to successfully establish blackberries and raspberries on your farm and some of the kind of early management uh, things that you should be thinking about. This talk is really kind of designed for somebody who's newer to growing blackberries or raspberries, or if you've never cultivated them on your farm. Um, uh, I'm going to kind of go over some of the general information about how to get a planting established so that it can grow, hopefully, you know, uh, to be as old as um, up to 20 years. So, um, oh, and what I wanted to mention is I am on the Delmarva Peninsula, so most of my experience with blackberries and raspberries is in Zone 7B, which is where Salisbury is, and I think you guys in New Jersey um, probably most of you are a little bit further north or in a little bit colder USDA zone. And so I'm going to try to make this relevant for you as well. But most of my experimental work has been on blackberries. Raspberries don't there's not as much commercial production of raspberries in my area of Maryland, close to the beach, on the Eastern Shore. And we'll get into why that is in a little bit. So first, I just kind of want to go over what kind of markets you want to target when and thinking about that before you establish um, your crop. So, are you going to be selling U-pick, or do you have a farm stand, or are you more of a wholesale grower? Um, Getting clean plants, planting at the right time, right spacing, and then transplant care, selecting the right cultivar that also makes sense for your hardiness zone, and then setting up proper trellising. So you always want to think about before you go to plant or make a big investment in a crop like blackberries and raspberries, which cost a lot in terms of the initial investment. Um, where are you actually going to be selling these? So, what cultivars you end up purchasing to plant should be influenced by what your market is going to be, and then how many you should plant of each cultivar, or how big of an area you want to plant. That should also be something that factors in to, what is the volume you think you can realistically sell, and then sort of plan your planting accordingly. So just some general rules. If you're going to be running a U-pick or a farm stand or selling your product at a farmer's market, I think it's a good idea to think about incorporating unique cultivars that have unique fruit characteristics, either large fruit, fruit with a specific flavor, but you may also want to incorporate cultivars that are early, mid, and a late season, so you have a long harvesting window. Um, and maybe you can discount some other qualities like shelf life. Maybe that's not as important to you as it would be if you were wholesale. And you can maybe select some varieties that have these interesting and unique characteristics, but maybe don't yield quite as well. Whereas if you're planning to sell wholesale, then you want to look for these higher yielding cultivars, longer shelf lives, so good firmness, good fruit firmness. This is really important and has been selected for much with strong selection pressure for some of these new cultivars, especially blackberries. Some of them have a lot longer shelf life potential now. And then, of course, disease resistance. Okay, so real quick, blackberries and raspberries, they are very closely related. They both belong to the Rubus genus. They have very similar life cycles. They both grow on biannual canes, which means that each cane only lives for 2 years. The first year of growth we call a primocane, so kind of makes sense. Prime, it's the first year, and then the second year um, that cane is called a floricane because in the wild or wild genotypes, these would be flowering only on second year canes. Now you can buy and select cultivars that will flower on first year canes, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But your plantings of blackberries, both blackberries and raspberries, should last at least 10 years. I think about 15 years is standard. You'll notice that yield will start to decrease over time. But if you have a huge disease incidence or a spot in the field that stays consistently wet, you could be losing production sooner than that. The primary differences between blackberries and raspberries, if you're kind of trying to decide which one you want to grow, in general, blackberries tend to be a lot more heat tolerant. A lot of the new varieties are very vigorous, more so than raspberries. So you end up, I think, doing more pruning in the summer. They tend to be less cold hardy. This is kind of this is cultivar to cultivar specific to some degree, but in general, they're less cold hardy and they are they tend to be higher yielding. Not every cultivar, but in general, you will get a bigger yield from blackberries. Whereas raspberries, I mean, this is sort of a this could be debated, but in general, they're more of a consumer favorite. I like raspberries better. I think most people I talk to prefer raspberries to blackberries. However, the big problem with them, at least in my region, is that they are not very heat tolerant. They have a pretty short shelf life. A lot of these cultivars are very delicate. And so you have to be very careful with your harvesting, but they do tend to be more cold hardy than blackberries. So I think for anyone in North Jersey, raspberries, they may make more sense for you than blackberries. Okay, and so getting your plants, you can purchase blackberries and raspberries in a bunch of different kind of sizes and at different price points. For my cultivar or variety trials that I have on the research farms here, I purchased plugs, which came from tissue culture. For me, that I thought was the best option because when you purchase a plant that's been tissue cultured, you know it should be disease free and virus free. And so these little plug plants when I planted them, took off very well. But the cheapest option is usually purchasing bare roots plants, which can sometimes just be kind of the root, or also some cane attached to it. And these are usually you're going to want to plant these in the spring. Um, and then I don't know if anybody in Jersey does long cane production. I think a lot of this happens more in the Northeast. I don't really see it in Maryland, but these are these are basically fully grown, um, uh, usually raspberries. They are more expensive because you're buying a grown plant, and you're basically putting it usually in a pot, um, fertilizing it, and getting a quick return. So getting that crop, as soon as 90 days later, from plant purchase. If you're looking for a good place, or if you're looking for a place to find different nurseries, I would suggest you check out the North American um, uh, the Raspberry and Blackberry Association, NARBA. They have a list of different, I think, nurseries that also sponsor them, but all of these nurseries sell to commercial growers, and they sell different types of plants. So some uh, some bare roots, some are tissue culture. So you can sort of take your pick and you can see on the website which nurseries do what. So for both blackberries and raspberries, you're going to want to be planting them when soil temperatures are above 50 degrees. Um, Generally, the spring is best, but you can also plant them in the fall. Raspberries, you're going to space a little bit tighter usually than blackberries. So in-row spacing can be anywhere from half a foot or 18 inches to 3 feet, with at least 8 feet in between your rows. This is somewhat variable. You just want to make sure that you have enough space between rows, that you can get your equipment in there. So depending on what type of equipment you have, space accordingly. Whereas with blackberries, 2 to 4 feet is what we recommend for upright cultivars in terms of in-row spacing. Whereas if you're growing a trailing cultivar, these are the vining type that require a lot more training. These need more distance between plants. So 5 to 6 feet. And you'll see on the cultivar description whether it's a trailing or an upright slash like erect variety. And I would give 10 feet between blackberry rows to be able to drive your equipment in there. So in terms of selecting like a good field location, it's pretty critical to be able to supply irrigation. I think for home growers, they don't necessarily have to do this, but if you want to be growing commercially, I would make sure you have the ability to irrigate. Both of these crops like full sun. A slight slope is a good thing. Where I'm at, we really don't have a lot of slope, but I think a lot of you in New Jersey probably do. Um, uh, Here in Maryland, you would probably have to I mean, you have to do soil tests, but I'm not sure in New Jersey. I would always recommend this. Uh, you do almost all the berry plants prefer high organic matter soils, so um, upwards of 2 or 3% would be good for growing blackberries or raspberries. They're not quite as picky as blueberries. And then also in terms of pH, not nearly as picky as blueberries. They do well with a 6 to 6.8 pH, soil pH. So you don't need special acidic soil or anything to grow them. Um, and as far as your row orientation, as long as this makes sense in your field, you should run your rows north to south. not east to west. Now, if that doesn't really work with your slope, you may not be able to do that, but you're going to get the best, most even light to the plants if you run them that way. Okay. I get asked this question here in Maryland, at least. Do you have to plant blackberries and raspberries on a raised bed? And the answer is, of course, it depends. So you don't necessarily have to. At some of my field sites, at least blackberries are planted not on a raised bed. At other sites, they are. This just kind of depends if you have really heavy soil. If you have any spot like low spots in the field that stay wet, then it's probably a good idea. Or if you just have a field that doesn't drain very well, all of these are good reasons to plant on a raised bed. If you have fairly sandy soil like we have here on the eastern shore of Maryland, then I don't think that it's super necessary. But basically, all of these berries don't love having wet feet. That's a recipe for disease, like in most crops. So this is kind of at your discretion. And in terms of first year management, you're going to want to suppress those weeds the first year, and you can do this with, I used bark mulch, but I mean, you can do this mechanistically. Wouldn't suggest using, unless you're using a pre-emergence herbicide, I wouldn't suggest, you know, doing a lot of spraying the first year that you have plants in the ground, especially in row. And then the first year, you really only need a minimal amount of fertilizer. I think in the Mid-Atlantic Berry Guide, the recommendations are 30 pounds of nitrogen in 2 split applications. But of course, this depends on your soil type. If you have heavier, more clay-based soil, you can get away with a little bit less nitrogen. And if you have highly sandy soils, like what I have here, you may want to use a little bit more nitrogen. And if you're not thinking on a per acre basis, if you're just thinking about this in rows, uh, Ohio Extension recommends using a 10-10-10 blend of fertilizer. I mean, I would only recommend using something like this if you actually need the phosphorus. Um, Here on the eastern shore of Maryland, most of our soils have plenty of phosphorus, so I would not use a 10-10-10 in my plantings. I don't know how it is in New Jersey, uh, but you want to make sure you're getting adequate nitrogen at least 2 weeks after planting, and then again 6 weeks after planting. And you're going to apply this nitrogen in a band down the row. So you don't need to apply it to the whole field, but really in the band where your plants are. In the following years, you want to make sure that you're pruning out suckers that start growing outside of your trellised area. That's all this slide's trying to point out, because both blackberries and raspberries are going to sucker a lot depending on the variety. Okay. So getting into cultivar selection, these are just 2 different blackberries, and you can kind of see that Ouachita here on the right has more of an upright growth habit, whereas Celestial here on the left is more of a semi-upright blackberry cultivar. So we'll talk a little bit more about this. So this is this is a chart of thornless blackberries and their harvest windows. It's really for Maryland. I think it's probably fairly similar for most of you guys in New Jersey. But these are more or less, I think, most of the thornless varieties that are available right now. And you can see that most of these varieties are out of the University of Arkansas breeding program. All of those that have Native American names. So Natchez, Ponca, Arapaho, Caddo, Osage. Those are all Arkansas varieties, and they kind of tend to look alike and have similar plant characteristics. Whereas varieties with space sounding names like Galaxy, um, Eclipse, Celestial, Twilight, those all come out of Oregon, and they tend to be a little bit more similar too. So those are two of the big breeding programs. And then here are just a couple more thornless, upright, and semi-upright cultivars. And then in green are two of the varieties we recommend if you are interested in growing blackberries as primocane fruiters. I think this practice is a lot less common than growing raspberries for primocane production. Okay, so getting into some of these raspberries, there are a lot to choose from. Uh, and I will be honest, I don't have a raspberry cultivar trial, so this is information that I have gathered because really we are just a little bit too far south to viably commercially grow raspberries. What I will have you note is that there are a lot fewer thornless raspberry cultivars than there are blackberries. And I think that's because raspberry thorns aren't quite as horrible as blackberry thorns. Blackberries have really nasty thorns, and I think people are just more willing to deal with raspberry cultivars that have thorns. But that said, if you're doing a U pick, I think thornless variety is always a good idea. Um, you know, people much prefer to deal with plants that don't have thorns. Yeah, so talking about raspberries, they just don't hold up in the heat and the sun. When it gets over 85 degrees or we have a high UV index, you start to see sun scald. And there really aren't any southern breeding programs that I know of for raspberries. Um, I know that shade cloth can be an option. This is fairly labor intensive. But yeah, in general, raspberries are more delicate than these other berry crops, and they don't hold up very well when the heat of the summer kicks in. I also wanted to mention a couple of purple and black raspberry varieties. Um, these are fairly popular in Maryland. I don't know so much about Jersey. Um, these are good novelty um, things to grow. If you're wholesaling, I would not recommend any of these because especially black raspberries don't yield as well as even raspberries and definitely not as well as blackberries. Um, but they bring people in and they are a novelty product that you can't, for the most part, buy at a grocery store. Um, I will say the purple raspberries are a cross or hybrid between black raspberries and red raspberries. And so something like royalty does pretty well. Like it's a pretty robust plant, but it doesn't actually taste that good. So yeah, it depends what you want here. The most common way to trellis black or raspberries is either usually with an I trellis or with a T trellis. That's what I see most of the time. And so you can see T trellis is just a T-shaped trellis. These don't need to be as tall as the trellises that you're going to be building for, say, blackberries. Um, and when it comes to primocane raspberry production. So this is when you grow a single year of raspberries that are going to fruit in the late summer. You mow them down and you kind of treat this as an annual system. This is what your field would look like in the winter after you've mowed. So just talking about floricane versus primocane raspberry production. So floricane production happens on those second year canes that overwinter. These tend to be higher yielding. Uh, and you can grow a primocane fruiting variety and then let it fruit on floricanes as well. So just because you grow a primocane fruiting variety does not mean that you have to practice only primocane production. You can still harvest those floricanes. So yeah, but if you choose to do only primocane production, you just let those canes grow the first year, then uh, you harvest later in the season. So this is like mid to late summer, a lot of times going into the fall. What I will say is you're going to have more spotted wing Drosophila pressure or risk kind of the later it gets in the year, but I'm not going to talk about that because I think Kelly's going to talk about that. And so these are just two different systems of production, at least for raspberries. I don't see the primocane production system used as much for blackberries, at least here. Another way that raspberries tend to get grown is the hill system. So this is where you keep all of the raspberry canes that come out of um, uh, that come out in a single hill, I guess. So you manage each bundle separately, and then the suckers that would be between these plants or outside of the hill get removed, and you're only really supposed to allow 3 to 6 canes per plant. So the benefits to a system like this are that you're going to get increased airflow between plants and lower disease pressure. However, you're going to have a lower yielding field because the opposite type of production system would be a hedgerow. This is where you kind of let the plants grow continuously down that row, and you get the fruiting wall effect. This is going to theoretically give you higher yields per acre, or it should, because you have basically more area of fruit production, more area of surface area for leaves. So you're getting more photosynthesis. However, you're going to have less airflow, so you have increased risk for disease, right? Okay, and so moving into blackberries, your trellis system is really going to depend on the type of cultivar you plant. So if you're planting a trailing cultivar versus a semi-erect or an upright or erect cultivar, that is those have different methods of management. So these upright or erect cultivars have mostly been bred in the eastern US, and they tend to be more cold hardy. Basically, if they're coming out of the Arkansas breeding program, usually they have more cold hardiness, or North Carolina. They work better here than some of the varieties that have been bred out in Oregon, which actually don't have the cold hardiness for the mid-Atlantic. Okay, and just real quick, parts of the trellis. Blackberries are going to weight down a trellis more than raspberries. They end up just producing more biomass usually. So you want to have a big anchor post and lines going down the row. So inline posts. These can be T-posts, they can be wooden posts. Whatever you want to use. Top and bottom wires. The recommendation is that your top wire be a thicker gauge than your bottom wire. You could use the same gauge, but if you're going to use a thicker wire for one versus the other, use that thicker wire on top. So like a 12.5 gauge wire. So if you're planting trailing cultivars, you can use a 2-wire trellis system. And this is where you would train all of your primocanes. Um, and it's more similar to, say, like wine grape production. And some of the varieties that this simple two-wire trellis makes sense for are Triple Crown, Chester, Zodiac, Sweetie Pie, Boysen, and Columbia Star. And then there are a lot of thorny varieties, mostly from Oregon, that are all uh, trailing cultivars, if that's what you want to grow. Now, if you want to grow more upright cultivars, you can also use an eye trellis system, which I kind of mentioned back in raspberries. However, this is probably going to be your lowest yielding system in blackberries, so we would recommend that you use something like a T trellis. Or a V trellis. So the V trellis is going to be wider on top, and that's going to allow for more air circulation. And those primicanes, the primicanes are going to shoot up inside, and you're going to have floricanes on the outside of that T trellis. And in general, like these can cost a little bit more in terms of like the posts. Uh, that you're required to use, but you can always change the height of your wires. So if you set the wire too high, you could bring it down in the future. Versus if you use a T-trellis system and you have nailed in T's, uh, that's hard to adjust those top and bottom wires. However, uh, you can spend a little bit less money doing a system like this. Um, just really quick, most of your pruning should be done in the winter. When you go through, you're going to prune out all of the floricanes from that year. So anything that has already fruited needs to go. You also want to prune out laterals that have become too long. What is too long? 18 inches. You don't want laterals that are hanging down. And I don't like any laterals that really hang down below, much below the bottom wire, because when they get laden with fruit, I don't want them on the ground. Um, yeah, so remove all those low laterals and any dead tissue. Um, Other like pruning mistakes would be leaving too many canes. So this can be if you're pruning in the spring or summer as well, ignoring lateral growth. So when you go through and do tipping, you still want to get rid of laterals that are too low. Um, Poorly training to a trellis, and then leaving too many weeds. So when you go through pruning, you might as well be weeding as well. So, real quick, if any of you are not familiar with it, uh, there is a Mid-Atlantic Berry Guide, and we are updating it. So theoretically, there should be a new Mid-Atlantic Berry Guide within the next year. Because this one, I think, came out in 2013 or 2014. Um, while most production practices really haven't changed that much in this time, it is going to be updated. It will have new cultivars and some different tables in the new version. So just keep an eye out for that. I have a couple of blackberry fact sheets if you're interested. I'd be happy to show you where those are, or you can just Google them. It's very hard to find them on our University of Maryland website, so I always end up Googling them. And I just want to acknowledge the funders that have uh, provided funds for us to do blackberry research at the University of Maryland. So, all right.
Thank you
Hope I
so
didn't go
much,
too long.
Haley. Yeah, that was awesome. Um, well, we have two questions that came in. I thought we have a little bit of time here before Kelly gets started, if you're okay to answer those,
Sure.
Haley. We had two questions from Sajad Mir. The first question, what's the shelf life of raspberry and blackberries?
So this is pretty variable. Um, I some of the newer blackberry cultivars that have really good firmness, and a lot of times you'll see in a cultivar description that they're not leaky. You don't want leaky. Leaky is bad. Um, I think you can get if they go into cold storage right away, easily 2 weeks out of them. With raspberries, I would be very surprised if there are any cultivars, I don't know, that do well in storage for 2 weeks. Um, I don't know as much about the raspberry varieties in terms of what their what the differences are in their shelf lives. But I would look for that when you are reading through the cultivar description before you purchase a plant. Make sure that it says that it has firmness or shelf life, or if you're dealing with a representative from a company where you're buying 500 plants, make sure to ask them because some of
Mm,
these raspberry cultivars really are very delicate and really would only work for a U pick. So,
okay, great. The second question, also from Sajad Mir, is what type of soil is most suitable for blackberries, raspberries, and blueberries? And that's kind of a
so
multi-part question.
yeah, it's a little bit more. So blueberries, you kind of got to put them in their own category because blueberries need the primary thing that differentiates them from other crops is that they need highly acidic soils. So they want their pH under really under 5. They're happy at 5, all the way down to 4.5. There really aren't a lot of other crops that want that other than cranberries. Um, so, yeah, the soil you need to grow blueberries in, it has to be acidic, and then blackberries and raspberries don't want that. They want pretty normal soil pH, above 6. Above 6 is fine, which is what most crops want. In terms of soil texture, all berry crops like high organic matter. And I say that because I live in a place where our soil is pretty sandy. So you do well in my region with sandy loam soils to add some organic matter at planting. And you can do that in a variety of ways. I added mulch, so that increases the soil organic matter. But really, a sandy loam to a loamy sand, anything with decent drainage is going to be okay for planting blackberries and raspberries. The soil just needs to be able to drain. And if it doesn't drain well, then you can use a raised bed.
Great. All right, thank you, Haley. If there are any more questions for Haley, please put them in the Q&A or chat, and we will have another session at the end that we can um, talk more about that. So with that, I'm going to ask Kelly, Dr. Kelly Hamby, to share her slides. And yeah, so Dr. Kelly Hamby is from the University of Maryland, associate professor and extension specialist. She works with a lot of smaller fruits, sweet corn, field crops. So yeah, you have a wide breadth of knowledge, particularly when it comes to the insect world, as well as the beneficials that we're seeing out there. So very happy to have you on, and yeah, take it away, Kelly.
Thank you. So as was mentioned, I'm going to cover some common pests and beneficials of caneberries today, so both raspberries and blackberries. And I just like to start um, talking about in general with pests, and I think in caneberries particularly, it's a lot harder to determine how many is too many. What is actually a pest problem versus we have a little bit of this insect in our planting. The pressure tends to be highly variable. We see lots of different things, but there's very few consistent pests, spotted wing Drosophila being the exception. And then their economic impact really varies based on whether, as Haley was mentioning, you're doing wholesale versus whether you're doing pick your own or fresh market. So this is something that means that you're going to have to really decide what level of pest damage is of concern for your farm. Are your customers complaining about it? Does it seem to be impacting your yield to a point that is impacting your bottom line? So keep that in mind as I'm talking about these different insects. The other thing I always like to do is just remind everybody, that using IPM best practices is really the best strategy for dealing with pests. And for insects, that really means thinking about making sure you're identifying and monitoring, so you're looking for things in your plantings. And then after you have figured out what you have, is it a problem, yes or no? And so that's why I also mentioned, is it a problem is really going to be dependent on your specific system and customers. As much as possible, you want to use preventative practices. If you do have a problem, the preventative practices didn't work, that's when we're going to take those management actions. And I also like to remind everybody, and I will kind of keep this throughout the talk, after you've done something, going back and seeing whether or not it worked is also really helpful. Again, each of these production systems, especially in small fruit, tend to be very unique. And so sometimes you may have unique issues or your situation isn't quite the same as the most common situation. So making sure that it's working for you is important. So it's really key for success that you're getting an early detection and an accurate identification of what your problem is. This gives you a lot more effective management options, and it also builds in time for you to figure out what it is if you're having trouble identifying it. And so, for example, I like to give an example of the brown stink bugs. So all of these species are brown stink bugs that I have seen in caneberries. So I've seen them in raspberries and blackberries. This species here, the brown marmorated stink bug, was an invasive species that was really important. Now it's become kind of part of our pest complex, and it is around. Then you have the common brown stink bugs that were native pests that were already here. But here, this is the spine soldier bug. And this bug, if you look up right here on the kind of the shield shape, it is a little bit pointier. And that's really the most distinctive difference between this. This one's actually a predatory beneficial. So this one's feeding on other insects in your field. And so this is what I mean in terms of identification can be very subtle, and it can be really important to figure out exactly which species you have. And as I mentioned, getting that identification maximizes your time for response. And there are some management options that really are available to you only when you have low populations of a pest. So the quicker that you can figure out you have an issue and respond to it, the better. So how do you make sure that you know you have an issue in time? We really encourage you to be regularly inspecting your plantings. You want to do at least one dormant inspection, so sometime during the winter you want to take a look. While the leaves are off, that gives you a really great chance to look for some things, and I'm going to run through some things that you might see. And then after you're starting to get bud break, you want to do it as regularly as possible. There are quite a few, and I'll mention a few of them, insect pests that reproduce very quickly and where you can miss them 1 week and then next week you have a real problem. So as regularly as possible, really ideally it would be weekly, taking a look at those plantings and seeing what's going on. So in terms of what you might be looking for during the dormant season, before the leaves are really out, some of the beneficials that you might be finding in particular are the solitary bees. So you may see in the dead spent tissues, you might see these little holes. So those little holes are actually bee nests for solitary bees. And they rely on having hollow canes of plants to have their nests. So they really like pruned tips and spent canes as a place to nest. They're never going to be nesting in fresh tissue. They're not causing direct damage to the plant. And that's where they live over the winter. So this is what's inside those hollow tubes. If you leave those nests there, the next year you'll have more pollinators coming out inside your planting. And also, there are some recommendations if you want to promote having more of these around your farm. You can leave stems. So you want to leave them like 18 inches long at least, some kind of stem. Any plant really will do. They do particularly like raspberries and blackberries because they tend to have a pith that's really easy to get into for a nest. But that gives them new nest sites. So after the adults emerge, they're going to be looking for new nests for their offspring in this season. So that's something that you can do to promote beneficials in your field. Another beneficial that we see a lot during the winter are actually the egg cases of praying mantises. So these are called Eutheca, or egg. That's what the egg case is for entomologists. And these two are both Chinese mantis egg cases, which is an invasive praying mantis species. And it looks very similar, but slightly different depending on which species you have. But they're very light and hollow feeling, kind of almost like a styrofoam in texture. And all species of praying mantis are predatory and are feeding on other insects. So that's another good guy that you may be finding during the dormant season. In terms of pests, one of the pests, this is a very uncommon pest, but it's really difficult to see when the leaves are there. You should be looking for it when the leaves are there too, but oftentimes people are going to catch this in the dormant season when there aren't leaves, which is scales. And scale insects don't look much like an insect at all. They tend to be bumpy or kind of strange patterns like you can see here on the plant. But underneath that is a soft-bodied insect that's producing a hard case. And they can really sneak up on you, the scales. As I mentioned, though, in our area, it's very uncommon to have scale issues. It does happen, and it's worth looking for. Another thing that you're going to see best, and also is best managed during the dormant season, is the red-necked cane borer. So this is a beetle, and I'll talk a little bit more about its life cycle in a minute, but it causes these swellings on the cane when the larvae are tunneling within the cane. And those swellings are much easier to see in the dormant season and are also managed in the dormant season. The other thing that you will be able to see are crown borers. So crown borers are a different species than the red-necked cane borer, and they cause damage. They're feeding on the roots and the lower parts of the cane in the crown of the plant. Typically, you're going to see the plants are breaking off, and then you're going to need to cut where they're breaking off to then find this hollow tunnel that is full of frass and may have a larva inside it. But again, when the leaves are off, it's much easier to kind of have a look at the canes and see that they're breaking off and having problems. And it's also something that you're going to manage in the dormant season. The adults and the eggs you're going to find during the season, typically in the late summer and early fall. So they're actually, in this case, this is a moth, a clearwing moth species. It lays these red eggs towards the edge of the leaf on the underside of the leaf, and that's where the larvae in the late summer, early fall, they're going to be hatching and getting in to the crowns of the plant, but right before overwintering. So the best management for both the red-necked cane borer and for the crown borer are to remove the entire cane, and you want to do this prior to bud swell, and to dig out those infested canes and crowns in the case of the crown borer. So the best thing to do is to just remove that infestation. You're going to catch the larvae while they're inside the plant so they're not emerging as a next generation adult, and you've taken care of the problem. Also, they tend not to be so prevalent that that's going to be a big impact on your planting if you're taking these canes out. So that's the best thing to do. Sanitize, get rid of that as soon as you're seeing it. And this is just some more pictures of those raspberry crown borer larvae. They're down there in the crown. But it's a moth pest, so you're going to see this dark head capsule on the caterpillar that's feeding inside the roots and inside the lower parts of the canes. If you have a severe crown borer issue, you may want to do some insecticide applications, and the timing for that is in the dormant season. You either want to do it in the fall, so kind of mid-October to early November, and that would be targeting the younger larvae as the eggs are hatching and moving down, or you want to do them in the early spring, so the late dormant, when when those larvae are becoming active again after the winter. So the larvae need to be active so that they're out contacting the insecticide. And these insecticides are going to be sprayed targeting towards the crown where they are, so the lower part of the plant and the base, either via a soil drench or directed spray. Both Brigade and Alticore are considered to be very good products for these for this pest. You're going to need way more than 50 gallons per acre. In fact, they really recommend like quite a lot, usually 100 to 200 gallons per acre, sometimes upwards of 400 gallons per acre, directed at the base. The insecticide labels specifically provide really great directions on how to target these pests. So read the label of the product that you've chosen. If you're seeing significant pressure, roguing them out really is sufficient in most cases. You will probably see some people recommend using entomopathogenic nematodes. So these are nematodes that feed on insects. They live in the soil and they can kind of chase down those larvae inside the roots and the crowns. The economics and their efficacy have not been tested in the mid-Atlantic, so we don't really know how well they work. The people who have worked on this the most were in Arkansas, and they did find it to be pretty successful when they applied in the spring or summer when the soil is moist and warm. So the nematodes have to be really active and able to get into the crowns of the plant. And nematodes need soil moisture to be able to move. They're recommended that you irrigate before applying them so the soil is nice and moist and they can really get in and find those caterpillars. So moving out of the dormant season, if we're scouting as regularly as possible from bud break through fall, what might you be seeing? And I've split this up kind of in the time period of where you're looking at leaves and canes versus when you're looking at flowers and fruits. So in terms of the leaves and canes, one of the beneficials that you're really likely to see are spiders. So because we have that really complex architecture of these plants, they're kind of dense. There's lots of leaves, lots of sticks. There's quite a lot of spiders that will actually survive well in caneberry plantings. And so they're out there doing a good job of getting those insect pests and other arthropods that could be causing problems in plantings. We also tend to see a lot of assassin bugs. So these have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So you can see that this one is stabbing its mouth part into a fly. There's lots of species, both the nymphs and the adults are predatory. And this one here is a wheelbug. You may have seen it's pretty large, and it's called the wheelbug because of this kind of wheel-like pattern it has on its thorax. In terms of pests, one of the first signs you might see that you have cane borer issues during the time period where you have, plants growing and you have leaves going is a yellowing of the upper portion of the cane and dieback. Now, insects are not the only cause of yellowing of the upper portion of the cane and dieback, but if you also see these other characteristic symptoms I'm going to talk to you about, this is one of the earliest signs that you might have an issue. And as I mentioned, the redneck cane borer is one of the pests that may be causing this. And it's also, if you're going to see the adult beetle, it's most likely that you're going to be seeing this in the earlier part of the year, May and June, around flowering. And you can see this beetle sometimes up feeding on the foliage. Its foliage feeding doesn't matter. That's when it's out laying its eggs into the plant. And then the caterpillar is the beetle larva is what's going to burrow into those canes. And because they're feeding and kind of disrupting the movement of nutrients and water through those canes, you start to see that dieback. At this time of year, as I mentioned, you don't really need to manage this pest. It's very unusual to have to apply an insecticide for this pest. It's better managed by removing the canes during the dormant season. Another cane borer that's also a beetle, this one is a longhorn beetle, so you'll see these long antennae on it, that is active typically more in June and July, maybe even into August, is the raspberry cane borer. And this one, again, also it tends to, so the female will make these scars before she lays the egg. So you'll see this characteristic ringing about 2 inches apart. And that's the sign that she's laid her eggs. They really like fresh tips and shoots, so it tends to be higher up on the plant, and you may be able to dig out the larva. And so this is another one that's active when there's foliage out in the planting. You may also see blackberry psyllid symptoms. Typically, the blackberry psyllid becomes the adults become active. They're moving out of pine trees, so they overwinter in pine trees. They become active in late May, approximately, depending on the year, in the early spring. And then when they start feeding as adults, and also they will start laying eggs and having nymphs, you'll see severe curling of the leaf clusters, twisted canes, and shortened internodes. And so usually it really starts to ball up. But to be sure that you're not seeing herbicide injury or some other or virus or some other issue, you really want to check for the adults and the nymphs. So make sure that you've identified this correctly and that it is psyllid damage. So you may see they like to feed on the tips of the shoots. The adult psyllid. So this is the adult psyllid. It looks quite a lot like a cicada, but it's very small, less than an inch in total size. And this is one, so you can kind of get a sense of what they look like relative to a cane. If you open up those curls of leaves, you may be able to find, and the nymphs will produce wax, and that wax breaks off. So sometimes it really looks kind of like a mold, and you'll see some white stuff. But this is what the psyllid nymphs look like, and you're going to need some magnification to really see them well, and you may need to move that wax aside. But this is the characteristic for sure you have a psyllid. For both the psyllids and for the raspberry cane borer, what you want to do is really just cut out the damage. So remove and destroy those curled leaf clusters and cut at least 2 inches below where you're seeing that ringing to make sure that you've got the larva, because it will move up and down the cane a little bit. So you can keep cutting to make sure it's no longer hollow and you're not seeing damage, and just prune that damage out. Typically, we don't see very high amounts of this damage. Psyllid damage tends to be on the edge near pine trees, so it will be more of an edge pest. And again, just best managed by pruning it out and removing the material. So thinking about flowers and fruits, one of the beneficials that really likes to be in flowers and tends to also feed on thrips is the minute pirate bug. It's called a minute pirate bug because it's very, very small, smaller than a grain of rice. And it's also called a pirate bug because it's got this black and white like a Jolly Roger. So that as an adult. So these very small predators, we see them running around the flowers and the fruits. And this is what the nymph looks like. Because it's so amber in color, sometimes people don't realize that that's just the nymph of the minute pirate bug. And here you can see it's coming up actually on a small caterpillar. So they also feed on small caterpillars and eggs. Raspberries and blackberries are very attractive to pollinators. So you see lots of bees and butterflies, especially during bloom. So I also like to remind folks you really have to avoid insecticides during bloom and when pollinators are active. For floricane varieties, you may get a little bit more of a consistent bloom where it all blooms at once, and you don't want to be spraying while these plants are really actively attractive to the pollinators. With primocane, sometimes you're going to see there's some flowers out there while there's some fruit out there that you're managing. So this is where the when active piece comes in. That's when you want to be spraying at night to try to reduce your impact on those pollinators that are going to be less active at night than they are in the daytime. You also might want to choose the lowest bee toxicity risk option available that's going to be effective for your pest when you're managing pests around a bloom time. And again, you don't want to directly spray open flowers at peak bloom if at all possible. So for example, Alticore is considered a low-risk product for bees versus Mustang Max is a high-risk product for bees, and Delegate is a moderate risk, somewhere in the middle. And pollination does matter for raspberries and blackberries. We do tend to see some poor pollination issues. Almost always, this is going to be associated, rather than with insecticide use, it's going to be more associated with poor weather. A lot of times when it's cool and wet, the pollinators just aren't active enough. You also can get crumbly berries from having really cold weather and the fruit not setting well. Other things that look like poor pollination are virus symptoms, so you may have to spend some time diagnosing why your fruit look like this. And then finally, the key pest of raspberries and blackberries throughout the United States is spotted wing Drosophila. And if you're looking for spotted wing Drosophila, typically what you're going to see first is leaky fruit. And here's the larva of the spotted wing Drosophila in a raspberry. They really, really love raspberries. So looking at the floricanes and the primocane varieties, the floricane fruit or the earliest ripening fruit tends to be lower in the canopy. That's where you're really going to see the first signs of activity. And pretty much if you have fruit that's susceptible, so if it's turning pink, if it's colored up, you're probably going to have spotted wing Drosophila. The adult flies are just like the Drosophila that you see in your house. They're very small. The male has a spotted wing. The female does not. The larva does not have a head capsule. So if you have a larva with a head capsule, you probably have sap beetles if it's a similar size, so about the size of a grain of rice. Or you may be seeing some raspberry fruitworm, which is a caterpillar. I see that very rarely. How do you manage spotted wing Drosophila? It has been found that the frequent harvest intervals and removing fruit as often as possible can really reduce infestation. So where you're picking clean, where you're picking often, you really see less issues with spotted wing Drosophila. And when you harvest, you want to remove and destroy those cull fruit. What does destroy mean? You want to bag and solarize, bury it to at least 10 inches, or compost it, possibly even with soldier flies, has been something that people are researching. So you really want to get it off property and kill those insects. We're also releasing natural enemies to try to help reduce spotted wing Drosophila issue. They have a very broad host range, and so we're hoping these wasps are going to be able to go out and find spotted wing Drosophila in non-crop areas. But typically what is required if you want to have if you have very low tolerance for larvae and fruit is weekly insecticide applications under heavy pressure. And as Haley alluded to, the later in the season your caneberry's fruit, the more spotted wing pressure you have. None of these insecticides are completely rain fast, so you're going to have to reapply after rain. And you really want to rotate modes of action because they reproduce so quickly. They are at risk for developing insecticide resistance, and you need to get good coverage. Caneberries are their favorite crop. Getting good coverage and getting good control in caneberries is very difficult. And they like the center of the canes and the lower fruit, which is also harder to target with insecticides. In terms of products, we have quite a few products that have a 1-day pre-harvest interval in caneberries and that are good to excellent in terms of efficacy for controlling spotted wing Drosophila in multiple modes of action. So you may be using the IRAC group 3As or pyrethroids like Mustang Max. The Spinosyns, Delegate, and Entrust, if you are organic, is an OMRI listed product. Also, the diamide insecticides are good to excellent. You'll notice that most of these are pretty high toxicity to bees, with Delegate being really the best, Delegate and Trust for the bee toxicity rating. And then the ones that I recommend less are Malathion and Grandivo. Malathion, you need a 24C, and Grandivo is the best alternative OMRI listed product, and it's got fair efficacy. But if you're OMRI, it's a good rotational partner for Entrust for organic registrations. We've been looking at some insecticides that are coming down the pipeline. As I mentioned, there are very few products that work well in caneberries, and I have seen nothing new on the horizon that is promising on the insecticide front. I did want to give a little plug for spray coverage. So this is my lab. We have put a raspberry on a chopstick. We did both sides, and we're moving the sprayer to create variation in coverage on our chopstick raspberry. And then we introduced spotted wing Drosophila in the lab to see how that worked for control. And we used two different concentrations of 50 gallons per acre and 100 gallons per acre to try to improve that spray coverage. And we did high spray coverage, or about 85%, and low spray coverage, about 20%. These were realistic values based on spray coverage we evaluated on people's farms. And then 50 gallons per acre and 100 gallons per acre also will have different concentrations in the individual droplets. So that's why we wanted to look at that. So then we put flies in there and we had an untreated control. So what we're looking at on the y-axis is how many flies died, the percent of them that died, for 50 gallons per acre versus 100 gallons per acre. And then the dark blue is the high spray coverage of about 85%, and the light blue is the low spray coverage of about 21%. So regardless of whether we were using a 50 gallons per acre concentration or 100 gallons per acre concentration, we got significantly more adults dying when we had high spray coverage. So when we reached 85% spray coverage, when we were spraying those raspberries with Mustang Max in the lab. And then that compared to the low spray coverage. Regardless of whether we were doing 50 or 100 gallons per acre, we did find that we had less than one larva per female, and we also found whether there was no difference between high and low spray coverage and infestation. So we were killing more adult flies with higher spray coverage, but it practically didn't translate to having a difference in infestation when we were in the lab and using Mustang Max. So they weren't laying eggs, even though they may be surviving, in this case, in the laboratory. But I still think it's a good reminder that spray coverage really can impact how well you're controlling an insect pest. And what we found when working with growers is that sprayer calibration was really the most important determinant of coverage, even more so than the carrier water volume. So we really expected carrier water volume to be the most important, but because many of you are growing on diversified farms and using your sprayer for multiple crops, you know, things like lowering the sprayer so that it's really targeting the canopy of the caneberries, those made a big difference for spray coverage. So we really recommend that you evaluate coverage on your farms. And this is Maggie Lewis, who is my PhD student who did the spray coverage work. So in terms of spotting Drosophila best practices, we really recommend timely harvest and horticultural best practices. Pruning to open up the canopy can help with spray coverage as well, but we found it doesn't economically make sense unless it's also, you know, the right answer for your yield and other production practices. We're largely still reliant on insecticides, especially in zero tolerance situations, and we have all been working very hard to find alternatives to insecticide for managing spotted wing Drosophila, and hopefully some of those are nearing commercialization in the near future. I also wanted to remind you, because we tend to spray so much for spotted wing Drosophila in blackberries and raspberries, most of the other insect pests are really well controlled. You're going to pick up these other things with those sprays. However, if you have issues with broad mites, which is what we have here, and here these are those broad mite eggs, or spider mites, you really need to use an appropriate miticide for those mites. There are some insecticides that claim that they're going to control mites, but really miticides are the best option for controlling mites. So finally, as a quick reminder for the IPM practices, make sure that you're keeping records. Did it work for you? What are your consistent issues? That is really what's going to help you refine your future pest management. So I'd like to thank my lab, my collaborators, and my funding sources for helping me with all of this work. If you would like more information, I have posted a lot of the resources on my website, hambylab.com. We have various articles, and you're also welcome to email me at kahamby@umd.edu.
Thank you, Kelly. Let's leave this up for a second so people can record that. And I think we have time for at least one of the questions that we got here, if you can provide that. So one of the questions from Sajid Mir was, what is the economic threshold level for borers at which insecticidal intervention is recommended?
There's not really a specific one, and I have not seen personally borers at a level where I would think that we would need insecticide intervention in the mid-Atlantic. It's more common to see that in the South. Presumably they just have higher pest pressure. Um, but if you are finding year after year you're consistently having issues, that might be a sign that it might be worth doing an insecticide intervention.
Okay, great. Great, fantastic presentation. Thank you, Kelly. We have another question, but we'll save that to the next session. And if there are any more questions for Kelly, please put them in the chat or save them till the end. So thanks, Kelly. With that, we'll ask Matt to share his slides. And while he's getting them up, I'll introduce Matt. Dr. Matt Bertucci is Associate Professor at University of Arkansas, working in extension in fruit and vegetable production. And Matt's been doing some work with pre-emergent, post-emergent herbicides in blackberries. So Matt will share some of that research findings and some background on weed management. So with that, I'll take it away, Matt. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Janine. And is this supposed to go to, I'm in Central Time, like 1:45, or should I be trying to
Oh,
get?
yeah, forget you go that way. Yeah, 2:45 we'll bring
Okay,
Sarah. So,
cool.
yep.
Just wanted to make sure I didn't get behind on anything. And I also was going to tease Kelly that I'm like, I must have been desensitized. I was eating my lunch, and I've just been desensitized to all the little grubs. All right. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate being here. This was actually work, a lot of this is looking at work that my first master's student did. So I was trained at NC State for my PhD in weed science and watermelon systems. But, it was just conventional weed management, looking at pre-emergent programs, what post-emergent options are available. And, my current position is sustainable fruit and vegetable production, and I have a lot of growers who kind of shy away from chemical interventions. Um, but I wasn't going to make my first master's student like learn with me. I wanted to give her something that was bite-sized. So I have like a good set of programs looking at what pre-emergent options are available, looking at a problem that we had because we have some herbicides that have come off the market or just not available. So the title that I put here was New Options, Old Options, Missing Options. Thinking about what herbicides we have available to us in caneberry production. Now, I'm going to be fully transparent. I've not worked with raspberries at all in this work. It's not something we have substantially in Arkansas. I've seen some people compliment it on their U picks, but it just gets too warm for the caneberries to be the raspberries to be a good, viable commercial crop. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little bit about Arkansas blackberries, get into weeds and IPM, how we look at it. Standard recommendations for blackberry production, specifically for weed management. Think about what challenges exist to the system. So where are we trying to manage weeds? How can we do it most effectively? And then what new materials can help with that weed control? And this was some work that I did with the IR4 program. And perhaps do we have those in the pipeline? I don't want to promise when they'd come out. So as far as Arkansas blackberries, I was glad to hear. I think it was Haley who was talking about the or the Native American tribes. That's one of those are the Arkansas releases. It's a really economically consequential breeding program, commodity in our state. And then we even have we're very fortunate. Arkansas is not a major horticultural state. We've got a lot of soybeans, a ton of pastures. We're the number one rice state. But this is a really shining example of a growers association. Our Arkansas Blackberry Growers Association was founded with the support of Amanda McWhirt, and they just have some of the most fantastic lateral information exchange. They really learn from each other in a way that I think is so admirable because I can get out here and say, well, I see there's a new label for Prowl and whatever, but they're going to tell each other that doesn't do anything on, Putleaf Evening Primrose. My experience, they trust each other, and I respect that. And so I really, really admire that group, and that's something that we're very proud of. And then we've also had the governor recognize June as Arkansas Blackberry Month. So that's just a fun thing for us. But in reality, our biggest farm, we have one corporate farm that's 400 acres of berry production. But for the most part, our operations tend to be diversified berry production, blueberries, blackberries, strawberries here and there. And they're complementary to some other horticultural system. Okay, so let's look at weed problems and what is it that weeds are doing and why are we frustrated with them? And the biggest thing is they reduce yield by competing for light, water, and nutrients. So I have some other slides when I get more long-winded, but the idea is when we create an environment to grow plants, we create an environment to grow weeds. They occupy that same ecological niche. So we're putting fertilizers down, we're opening up sunlight, we're exposing soil. As we're creating a space that is good for our crop, inevitably we're creating a space that's good for weeds. Um, the problem is when they emerge or come up alongside our crop. So this isn't a blackberry, this is a watermelon plant. But we did a study looking at, fixed populations of weeds. And of course, if weeds show up at the exact same time as your, seedling or transplants, they can quickly choke out your, cash crop. So, if they're shading out your cash crop, if they're taking up the water, if they're taking up the nutrients, that's going to come at the detriment of your, host crop. Other things they can do is they can harbor, insect or disease pests. So one of the first things you should do if you're trying to do commercial blackberry production is get rid of all that feral blackberries along, the wood lines and stuff because they can kind of harbor those pests, and it's almost like having unvaccinated people come into the population, right? If you're curating this pest-free space and trying to keep all these, problematic insect species out, but there's just incubation occurring only 25 yards away, there's the potential for them to then migrate into your field. And then weeds can also slow harvest or affect fruit quality. So if you have some sort of, vegetation, especially in these perennial plantings. So I was trained in annual plantings and I'm used to just resetting our field. Just till the field in, start over. But if you're committed to a perennial planting, things like pokeweed can push up through there. Other perennial weeds can get into your row, and it can be really hard to find those berries if there's, other foliage in the way. And if that other foliage is there shading out the fruit or disrupting pollination or light interception as the fruit's developing, we're going to have reduced fruit quality and development. So those are all the things, we understand weeds are problematic, but it's not just yield. They could harbor other pests, they could reduce fruit quality, they can slow us down when we're trying to pick these berries. This one, I was going to tease. Kelly did a good job. I was like, every time I hear IPM, people always say, know your enemy, know your enemy. And it's a really important framework. The people say, a specialist or an agent or someone tells you to know your enemy because you need to understand at which point in their life cycle they are susceptible to control, right? So if we're looking at annual weed species, controlling them from seed is an effective way to kill them. If we're looking at perennial weed species, the pre-emergent herbicides are not going to work. But an interesting, caveat to that phrase is it actually says if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. And this is really important to understand because I work with, and I was talking about Janine with this before the call. I work with a lot of growers who are um, trying to be organic or are organic in principle or are certified naturally grown. And they ask me, what are the options to kill this? What are the options to kill that? And it's so important to communicate with a specialist, with an agent, or, with another grower saying, I'm trying to kill, yellow nutsedge. Say where it is, because if it's in your lawn, the chemical options are very different than in a blackberry planting, or if it's in a conventional blackberry planting versus an organic blackberry planting. So you really need to understand your system and how you intend to intervene, as well as understanding these pest species. So just keep that in mind as we go through it. Are you a caneberry grower? Are you a conventional caneberry grower? Are you a U-pick operation where you're really concerned about people coming in and out of your farm? These are going to affect your tolerance levels and thresholds for certain things. But I find that IPM and, the alternative would be integrated weed management Tend to have the same components. Kelly did mention one that I tend to forget to comment. So the very first thing you can do is just prevent that, pest from showing up on your property. So there's all sorts of ways to try and mitigate weeds getting onto your property, whether it's cleaning equipment, being careful about any sod that you use, starting, clean, staying clean, this, that, and the other. But when it comes to control or interventions, when the weeds have shown up and we need to do something to get rid of them, these are the kind of categories that we have. So we have cultural control, mechanical control, biological control, and chemical control. So cultural would just be anything that favors the crop over the weeds. In our vegetable systems, that would be plastic mulch. In perennial systems, it would be more like landscape fabric or, some sort of organic mulch. Mechanical control is any physical destruction of the weeds. So, this is like the classic image of somebody hoeing out weeds or cultivation. Mowing is actually a form of mechanical control. And this actually would also capture all of the other things like flame weeding, steam weeding, and other, physical destruction of the weed species. Biological control, I actually fade out here. There are very few options that exist. I've seen commercialized products for, and Arkansas actually invented one in the 80s for like northern joint vetch control, but they tend to be extremely specific because it might rely on a fungal pathogen that kills this particular weed. And, they tend to be species specific, not broad spectrum, very costly. So biological control, I don't remove it entirely because I appreciate how valuable it is in entomology and for control of insects and things of that nature. But I don't think it really fits in a weed control framework for the most part. I've seen grazing animals, but that's, I would never recommend it as a practice because just saying, hey, go get some geese is a big ask for somebody who's just trying to grow berries. And, I put this purposefully. The last option would be chemical control. And I put it as the last option because we should be making sure we're putting ourselves and setting ourselves up for success before we go to chemical control as an intervention. But of course, there are all sorts of herbicides that can be used for selective control of problematic weed species. So let's take a hypothetical field, and we can see we've got our blackberries here planted in rows. We're not in California, so we get periodic rainfall. So we're going to have some sort of, vegetation between our rows. Where we're from, we can get Bermuda grass in there. I put a picture of fescue because that's a bunch grass, and I would prefer fescue if I could do that. So you might have some vegetation between your rows, but what about right up next to those rows? I would suggest as we're talking through this presentation, why don't we work from the inside out? And, close up to those plants, in the first 2 to 3 years, we want to keep it weed free 2 to 3 feet. And then as plants mature, they need a little bit more room, 4 to 5 feet, to get that full canopy development and exposure. So one thing we could do if we're trying to maintain that 2 to 3 or 4 to 5 feet is put down landscape fabric. You could either do it in 2 strips, you could punch holes. This is going to help a little bit with suckering, but there's always this spot. There's this interface between, the turf stand between your crop and the edge of the fabric. So even if you have fabric, some people may not use fabric, there's going to be an interface where weed management has to occur. So with or without fabric, we need to be thinking about some sort of intervention to make sure we don't get overrun with weeds. The best production guide that I've seen for this is the 2025 Southeast Regional Caneberry Management Guide, with the caveat that, this is going to be focused on labels that are available in the Southeast and recommendations that are available in the Southeast. And then a caveat that I also like seeing is, you know, while we're making recommendations, it is ultimately the responsibility of the applicator to follow it. So at the very bottom, the pesticide label supersedes any information contained in this guide and is the legal document. So that's us shedding liability, despite the recommendations that are in here. But When it comes to chemical control, much like Kelly said, I mean, one thing I would say is read the label. Just look at what it's advertised to do. That's a scientifically informed document, and they often tell you caveats about be cautious about if there's green wood here and shield this. And it's very important to follow those instructions. Calibration is very important. Coverage is super important. When we have non-selective materials, we're going to have to shield our plants. And then be very careful about timing your sprays properly. So, if you have a pre-emergence herbicide, that's only going to affect newly emerging weeds alongside our crop. So if you have a flush of weeds that's already emerged and you put out a pre, that won't accomplish anything for weed kill unless it has some sort of reach back post-emergence options. If you have a post-emergence application, oftentimes we have to be worried about the pre-harvest interval, the PHI. So being sure that we're not spraying something that's going to disrupt our ability to get that first pick of berries. And then if you're doing something that has pre and post activity, making sure that you're not getting interception on your caneberries if that's something that's going to cause problems. So being aware of what the chemistries are doing and how they should be used. One thing that's really nice, let's see, my pre-emergence comes later. I'll talk about that. If you're looking for the label, of course, every time you purchase a chemical, you're going to get it. I tend to look it up online because growers are asking me about products I've never purchased, or, I've gotten the technical material rather than the commercial product. So I go to CDMS and look things up. I go to Green Book. In Arkansas, I'm also able to find all of the registered chemistries with our State Department of Agriculture. I can't speak to that for New Jersey, but this is a great place to look for them because the digital pesticide labels are searchable. And then you want to be really careful that you look for caneberry, blackberry, bushberry. Use a number of different terms when you're doing your search because sometimes they show up under different things. This is what it would look like on the front, right? You can see the label listed here. The active ingredient is flumioxazin for Chateau. And then if you come all the way down, this is 51% active ingredient, by volume. And so this is going to be important if you're looking at something that's generic like glyphosate. We might make recommendations that say see label because glyphosate has so many different formulations that we don't want to have you accidentally putting out the wrong rate. So as I mentioned with pre-emergence herbicides, this is something that we can really take advantage of with perennial crops. Pre-emergence herbicides, it's not to say they never affect transplanted crops, but they tend to be lethal at the seed stage. So the first stage of germination is imbibing. So the seed takes up water. And so what we do is we put out a pre-emergent herbicide, we activate it with some sort of rainfall event, usually a 1/2 inch to 1 inch irrigation or rainfall. And then as these weed seeds try to start their germination, they're going to draw in water. And hopefully we've got the right herbicide rate to, terminate in whatever chemical pathway. There's like things that disrupt their cell walls, that things that, all the different ways that you can kill these, problematic weeds. But they tend to differentiate and only affect that seed stage with pre-emergent herbicides. It's not always true, but that's a nice differentiation that we can usually get away with overspray, a broadcast application that's intercepted by the, caneberries, but doesn't cause any problems for them in general. Now they won't last forever. Pre-emergent herbicides, it would be nice if they did, but we can get 28, maybe 30 days depending on rainfall patterns. 4 months that's an outlier. That's if you maybe got it's indaziflam. I think it's Allion in specialty crops, but indaziflam is a really long-lasting herbicide, uh, pre-emergent herbicide. But generally, at least in Arkansas, pendimethalin, oryzolin, simazine, we're looking at 21 to 28 days of control, 3 to 4 weeks. That 2 to 4 months is maybe a little bit longer. And if you reduce rates, if you go, like if it says 1.6 pints per acre, If you're on heavy soils, go up to 2 pints per acre. If you go on the low end, that residual control is also going to be reduced. You're going to get shorter periods of control. Just be aware. Now, with post-emergent herbicides, these are intended to kill weeds that have already come up and have already germinated and emerged from the soil. These are very important to get good coverage and interception by those weeds. And remember that it's easier to control small weeds than it is to control large weeds. And this is why weed ID can be really important. Y'all should mess with or ask Dr. Besson, Terry, about how to ID what weeds and which ones to get after, because selecting the right post-emergent herbicide to get after your target weed is very important. It is possible to do spot sprays, banded applications, or we do have broadcast applications. Most easily for us is control of grass species in caneberries because we have products like clethodim, sethoxydim, that would be like Select, Post, or Fusilade that don't cause harm to the caneberries but do kill grass species. You probably need a thing called a surfactant that's going to help us take up the herbicide or help the grasses take up the herbicide. And they may be selective or non-selective. And here I have a picture of a caneberry, a blackberry plant where it's not like it's supposed to look. This was a symptom of all things. Our fertilizer had been impregnated with herbicide. So it was a co-op that was selling fertilizer. The fertilizer had been mixed in a drum and they had been inoculating it with herbicide for pasture applications. And then they switched it out and just the residual herbicides actually had this carryover effect. So interesting problems that can be observed. So again, this is a reference where I would recommend getting things, or at least where we post our information. As I mentioned, we tend to recommend this weed-free strip width centered around our blackberry plantings. And then we have these different programs. And what's important is the programs differentiate based on early season, newly planted, or mature caneberries. So for newly planted caneberries, blackberries, they say to put out a rhizoline, pre-plant, and then you could also have a rhizoline plus simazine. But what I find is interesting, I've spoken about Arizolan. I've spoken about this product, and it's Surfland. And I've said it's actually, pretty hard to get a hold of Surfland lately. And someone raised their hand and interrupted me and said it's impossible to get a hold of Surfland. And so I don't know the story on it now, but I know that it's not been commercially available for a long period. Something to do with the disruption of the manufacturing. But if we go to that Caneberry guide, I joke that the weed science writers and editors just did a find and replace, and they just said instead of Arizolan, use pendimethalin. And so pendimethalin is a pre-emergent herbicide that's available, satellite hydrocap. And so here, instead of saying to use Arizolan, they say use pendimethalin. Instead of using simazine and Arizolan, they say go for simazine and pendimethalin. So where we lost some options, we've plugged in a new one, fortunately. So be aware of that. And I wanted to share this. This is just I'll go through it quickly because this is a project that I did with my master's student looking at all of these different pre-emergent herbicide options. So this is an overhead view of the different chemicals that we put on each of these plots of caneberries. And you can see these big vegetative strips between the plots is where no herbicides were applied. So we definitely needed some sort of vegetation management, and we were kind of assessing the crop response over a 2-year period, looking at Ouachita's response. So my student went out, did 2 applications in late spring of 2021, early spring of 2022, on newly transplanted blackberries, and then again on the blackberries that have come up. These are the treatments. So we did Devernal, Surfland, Prowl, Dual Magnum, Chateau, and Callisto, repeated over 2 years and at 2 different sites. And what we did was just looked at the crop injury, the plant height, looked at if they had any discoloration, and then the coverage of the turf underneath the canopy. So did we get good weed control? In 2022, that's when we got our first yield data. We looked at the, fruit and berry quality. And the good news is we actually saw no negative effects of these herbicides. So my student was underwhelmed because we didn't see major differences in our data, but we were able to look at certain observations and caution people. So if you look at the herbicide label for mesotrione, it is listed as available for first year plantings. And we thought, the injury that we saw, the symptoms that we saw, we would recommend that you look for something else because that bleaching herbicide symptom, if you just bought new immaculate blackberries and you're so excited about your new planting and then you spray something and it looks like this, or you get these symptoms that you get from flumioxazin, I don't think it's something that a grower is going to feel comfortable with. And we have alternative materials that can achieve similar levels of weed control. So we recommended against using these on first year plantings, at least as a broadcast application. Um, as we carried it out, an interesting thing, despite first year symptoms and early symptoms that, looked like this, plants grew out of it pretty quickly. And in Arkansas, we tend to grow too much blackberry. We have to throw a lot of blackberry canes away. Whoopsie, because of how much it grows. So by the end of the season, we couldn't tell what plots had what. After 2 years, everything was yielding similar and everything looked great. So while there's numerical differences in our yields, ultimately we saw, there was no difference in terms of injury. There was no reduced yield. So despite those discolorations in mesotrione, the statistics told us if we repeated this, there's no evidence that it would be different. So same thing, there was no issue with quality. I'll just summarize the data from this because I see I'm running short on time. I don't want to run out. With the pre's, we saw, mesotrione had unacceptable injury in 2021, but it didn't affect yield. And one thing that was nice for us is we were able to secure a 24C label for dual magnum S-metolachlor in our blackberries. So that was a nice outcome. We had never recommended pendimethalin in the past, but we saw that the label for satellite hydrocap is there instead of Prowl H2O. So that's a good thing that we saw. I'm going to quickly talk about these other two. So I mentioned new options. You can put out some pretty, I don't want to say harmful, but we were looking at herbicides that are not selective and how can we use these in blackberry systems. And one way to do them is to use either grow tubes or shielded sprayers of some kind. We used wax cartons here. And we sprayed shielded and directed applications of glufosinate, which is not labeled in blackberries. And, here we are with untreated glufosinate at 1x, 2x, and then another material, saflufenicil, Trevix. And, we could not see any issue. Of course, because we were completely shielding the plants. Now, when we repeated it later in the season, it was a banded application sprayed to the bottom of the canopy. Same thing. On the 2X, you can see some discoloration in the lower canopy, but we didn't see any symptoms throughout this enormous, 5.5 foot, 6 foot vertical canopy. That has to do with glufosinate being more of a contact herbicide. If you look up closely, you can see that 2X does have some symptoms. 1X has a little bit, but, also leaves just kind of senesce throughout the season. So it didn't look hugely different relative to the untreated. We did it again in 2023, repeated the applications to these plots, really not able to see dramatic differences. Injury ratings were low. Yields didn't differ greatly, except for the 2X rate was a little bit reduced. So not available, not labeled, but we have good evidence that, it could be used safely as far as crop production. And then the other thing that we tested was a product called 2,4-D choline or Enlist. And this was something I was really scared to do because we have grapes on the research station and grapes are so sensitive to 2,4-D. But what we did was we sprayed it 3 times before bud break, 30 days after that application, and then post-harvest. And we did that over 2 years, either as directed applications or banded applications. And I put rely here, sorry. Both rates caused no injury on the plants. Here we are, sorry. The injury was mostly in the lower canopy. So despite it being a systemic herbicide, we really only saw minor symptoms, and it really mostly was in the new canopy or the lower canopy. So here we had our untreated, when you looked at it as a whole canopy, there was not dramatic differences, though close-up symptoms were available. This was probably the very worst symptoms I could see. And you can see that it was not uniform throughout the canopy. It's kind of where it was intercepted, it got translocated, and that didn't look very good. And an interesting thing, I know Haley was talking about it initially, we have suckers coming up. And that was where I think we were getting intercepted because we were doing directed applications away from the plant. But if this is a systemic herbicide and you have suckers that are growing out of the row, that's where the herbicide was getting to the main plant. And so we didn't see it in, overall canopy, but we did see small symptoms. Ultimately, we didn't see any yield response. So, and the symptoms were minor. So our report was that we thought it had a use and utility in the system. However, that is still labeled material. So I think I'm there at time, but that was our kind of overall findings. We looked at a number of different pre-emergence herbicides. We got a 24C label for S-metolachlor, started recommending pendimethalin in place of arizoline, and we've got the potential pursuit of labels for some other post-emergent options in the future. So I'm going to leave questions for the chat, Janine. Here's where I was saying we often grow too many blackberries in Arkansas. This is all the blackberries we need to prune out and throw away. Somebody told me, uh, maybe that mesotrione could do us a favor by kind of slowing those darn blackberries down a bit.
Oh, too many blackberries and raspberries. Well, I guess that's a problem to have. Yeah, thank you, Matt. I will echo the mesotrione here, Callisto. I won't speak for Terry, but we've talked about this and we've seen a similar issue here. So I'm glad that you brought that up, that is not a recommended product in our blackberry raspberry production. So thank you. Okay, yeah, if you have any questions for Matt, please put them in the chat. And after our last talk, we will have some time for discussion. So thank you. And now Dr. Sarah Villani from North Carolina State University will be talking about diseases as she does best. And I always enjoy Sarah's talk. So with that, take it away, Sarah, please.
You never know what's coming out of my mouth, Janine. I'll say that much. I've been in Apple mode the last couple of talks there. So, good afternoon, everyone. Like Janine said, I'm Sarah Villani. I'm an assistant, soon to be associate professor. We're on a bit of a different time clock than Arkansas, but hopefully by the end of the month, we can move on. And I am the mostly fruit and soon to be actually vegetable pathologist here at NC State. So I sort of wear a number of hats, and because of my great team, we're able to work a lot on that. I come from the Northeast. I grew up in Geneva, New York, so the Finger Lakes area. My dad was a professor at Cornell, and I worked under Carrick Cox. I was his professor over there in Geneva at the Ag Station. So I was his technician, and then moved on to an employee degree program. And I have been with NC State now for slightly over 10 years. Started out predominantly working on apple diseases, and then when my position transitioned into a tenure track position, I also picked up caneberries, peaches, wine grapes. No strawberries yet, which I'm happy about given the Neopistolochiepsis problems. And so, yeah, as you know, there's a lot of diseases on caneberry that we need to contend with. And unlike apples and other fruit crops, we really don't have a lot of options as far as fungicides go to manage them. So what I'll say is that, fungal diseases and viruses are our two main pathogen groups, I would say, that we need to really worry about with caneberries. Bacterial diseases, yes, we can see some fire blight here and there, but we really don't need to worry too much about contending with bacterial diseases like we need to in other crops like tomato or an apple. And so, as Matt was mentioning there, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our Southeast Regional Caneberry Guide. Every year, we meet here in Western North Carolina, where I'm stationed in the mountains, in Mills River, and we develop the new spray guide basically for disease management, weed management, and arthropod management. And so what I really like to go to and what helps growers a lot is just looking at the seasonal at a glance management options. So I'll put a plug out for that. And really what we do in this is just walk you through the different phenology stages, going from the delayed dormant, and I don't know where you guys are at, probably past that delayed dormant at this point, but really going through harvest and guiding you along as the season goes on. Um, if you don't like that, we have additional options here for you. I've gone ahead, and the growers sometimes like to see this diagram a bit more, and we can share not only the talks with you, like the me giving the talk, but we can also certainly share my slides as well with you. But again, this kind of gives you just a glance at areas where you should be focusing on. I will point out here, and I'm not going to have time to get into this today, but very much like I do when I recommend fungicide sprays for, let's say, apple, more intensive crops, we are suggesting putting in a multi-site protectant fungicide, such as Captan, which is at low risk of resistance development, with some of those frac groups that are locally systemic fungicides that that tend to carry a higher risk for resistance development. And for those that don't know, again, I wish I could get into this more today, but for those of you who really don't know too much about frac groups or single site fungicides, really what we're dealing with here are fungicides that target specific enzymes or proteins within a fungus versus fungicides that target multiple sites within a fungus. So Captan, low risk at resistance development because it targets multiple sites within a fungal pathogen, whereas where you see the frac-3s, which are your DMIs, think Raleigh you might know a bit about, propiconazole, Sevia is another one. Your SDHI fungicides, those are your frac-7s. Think Endura, Boscalid, and then certainly your frac-11, something like Cabrio or azoxystrobins and things like that. Okay. And then one other resource that I made this year was growers were tired of seeing numbers or letters like excellent, good, and or like ratings for fungicide efficacy 1 through 5. And then you look across this chart and see a 5 here, a 4 here, and it would just kind of get all jumbled up. And so what we've done is we've made heat maps. This isn't too exciting, unfortunately, for caneberries, because we really do have a limited number of fungicides that you are able to apply. But we have this as well, and you can certainly print these out and laminate them if you want. Okay, and then one last resource, which I use regularly. Again, I studied apples, and I'm an apple person. And so moving into blackberries, I've been doing a lot of work with Guido Schnabel over at Clemson University in development of the My IPM app. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, but if you don't have it on your tablets or your cell phones, I suggest you go ahead and download this app, because what's great about it is that it covers many diseases of caneberries. If you grow multiple different variety of crops, you can get this now for most fruit crops. I also think vegetables and field crops also might have one in development. But there's a lot of renditions of this app. But what's really nice is you can scroll between different diseases. You'll get you'll go ahead and get high quality images of these diseases. This is a list of the suite of diseases we have for caneberry. And then you can look up trade names, active ingredients, cultural control, and so forth. And this also provides efficacy ratings in their frac groups, resistance risks, and so forth. So anyway, that's something cool for you guys to check out, and it's fairly self-explanatory once you get rocking on it. Okay, so in putting this talk together, I just couldn't figure, like, it's always hard, I feel like, to give a general disease talk because there's so many things I want to discuss with you. General disease management, which is much more generic, or fungicides and fungicides resistance, which I could spend a whole hour on. It's my bread and butter. But for today, I thought we'd just go ahead and focus on some of those diseases that I tend to get the most questions about. And then if anything comes up toward the end here that you want to touch base on, we can go ahead and do that as well. But it will kind of be a show and tell of some of these diseases here. Rust diseases, I tend to find are a fairly big deal here on blackberry. And I have got two of these shown here, and there's really three that you'll need to worry about on caneberries in general. And again, two of them are more specific to blackberry or black raspberry along those lines. All right, and those here are the cane and leaf rust. Sometimes you'll hear it called yellow rust, which really is a non-systemic rust. And so this is the good rust to have overall. You'll often see symptoms most dramatically, I would say, on the underside of the leaves, and these are called Uridinea spores. The rust that you want to go ahead and start screaming and pulling your hair out about is orange rust. Okay, and this is the rust that you don't want to see in your plantings, and that really can cause destruction because this rust can move systemically. All right, so first let's go ahead and just quickly chat about cane and leaf rust. Now is the time, I would say, or maybe in a few weeks in New Jersey, that you want to start scouting for this. And so Haley mentioned early on about floricanes and primicanes and blackberries, and hopefully you're pretty familiar with those, particularly after today's sessions here. But with this, what you'll want to start doing is scouting around mid-spring for these orange colored spores, and these are called Uridinea. These lesions developed on primicanes your previous season, and they probably went unnoticed. You are more likely focused on harvest and and removing old floricanes. But on the new floricanes, you'll start to see sort of this explosion or this extrusion of spores kind of cracking out of there. And then by early summer, these spores will then come on over and infect your leaves. Those are also Uridinea spores. Now, where I tend to see the most consequence with cane and leaf rust definitely comes to be with this premature defoliation. And I don't think a lot of credit's given to some of these foliar diseases that are reducing photosynthetic capacity of the plant and the ability of the plant to feed. And so what we're seeing quite a bit of is premature defoliation. Either growers are not continuing fungicide applications in plants where harvest has already happened early on in the season, and these get riddled with cane and leaf rust, or you just have a pretty bad case of it. But regardless, this is really going to affect this premature defoliation, your overwintering potential or capacity. And we're seeing a lot of cane dieback and opportunistic fungal pathogens invade simply because these canes are stressed. They're not acclimating for winter very easily because they're not, feeding themselves, and you're having this premature defoliation, no carbohydrate production or very little at that point. And then, you get into a real pickle there. When I was visiting Arkansas for their field day this past summer, or last summer, I guess at this point, we also saw really nasty infections of cane and leaf rust on the fruit. So kind of beware of that as well, that in severe cases, this can happen. All right, how are we going to control this? All right, certainly after harvest, one of the best things you can do is get rid of those floricanes and destroy them. Okay, oftentimes you're like, oh, we're done here, let's move on. But I would say that if you can get those canes out of your planting, that's best. Certainly, if not, go ahead and remove those canes, throw them in the row middles, and then mulch them in. Another cultural thing you can do is certainly inspect primocane infections and destroy those. And so this is, again, you're going to be busy with harvest and everything. But if you do see primocane infections later in the summer, go ahead and destroy those, because that's going to be your overwintering and primary inoculum for the next year. And then I really like the delay dormant application of lime sulfur. What I would say is make sure that you're not putting that on anywhere that where you start to see a lot of green tip, and certainly make sure that you don't have oil that is in the tanker left over. Apparently one of our field guys had a little bit of oil left over from one of our apple sprays in the tank, and then put lime sulfur on our cane blackberries a few weeks ago, and there's a bit of bud death in fried buds because of that. So just sort of be on the lookout there. Certainly with fungicides, I really prefer rotations of your Frac 3 with your strobilurins, the frac 11s. So again, this would be, or fungicides that contain frac 11s like Pristine, Quilt Excel, or you've got azoxystrobin, Abound, and Cabrio. Really, all of those are excellent. Same deal with the DMIs, with Tilt, Propiconazole, Rally, and then Sevi is a fairly new one by BASF, which has a 0-day PHI there, which is important for blackberries. But we like to start these early on, and then every 10 to 14 days or so, if you've got a problem, go ahead and continue that through at least bloom and then scout, but really try to keep that going throughout most of the season if possible. As I mentioned, orange rust. This one tends to look more like a virus. Early on in the spring, you're going to see spindly leaves emerging from the floride canes, and things just aren't going to look quite right. And as you might be aware, we'll talk about viruses in a few minutes here, but blackberries have over 40 viruses that can infect them. So your first thought might be, hey, this could be a viral issue. But very quickly, toward the middle to late spring here in North Carolina, I've seen it like by the second week of April sometimes. You'll see these waxy, bright orange pustules, and these appear very different. These are esiospores, so they're a bit different looking spores than what you'll see, not just color-wise, but in texture-wise as well, that then you'll see with the yellow or with the cane and leaf rust. And then again, what a crappy picture that is. But again, we need to start to look for these leaf drop and these weaks and spindly. If you have orange rust, my recommendation is you need to go ahead and you need to get rid of the plants. All right, and then rogue plants directly near those plants, and then adjacent rows that are facing those plants. So what I say to do is when I get my transplants for the year, I haven't seen any plants with orange rust symptoms come in anytime recently, but go ahead and inspect those transplants just in case. And then here's a funny, remove wild blackberries about a quarter mile from the field. These spores can travel by wind, which is the problem. But I mean, wild blackberries are really prevalent, and they're a magnet for orange rust. So that's really difficult to do. But if you take a mid to late spring walk and you see those, try your best to remove those or keep those a bit more tame, those plants there. And then once they're in the ground, what I say to do is, especially on susceptible cultivars, such as the poster child Navajo. We've also been seeing orange rust quite a bit on Ponca, and we're not sure if that's a specific strain that's causing the problems, or if there's some breakdown in some of the resistance in Ponca. But regardless, what I would do is, particularly if you have Navajo or another cultivar where you see orange rust, go ahead and make sure you're inspecting those emerging canes and shoots during the mid-spring timing for y'all. All right, and then if you see anything symptomatic, remove those canes and roots and destroy them. I would say go ahead also, and I like to throw down a herbicide application to try to really get in and kill off the rest of that tissue. Okay. And then certainly, again, cultivars, and we do have some resources online. I didn't put it in here today, but there are cultivars that are resistant or tolerant to orange rust. And a lot of the places that you might procure your blackberries from certainly will have that information on there as well. Again, very similar to yellow, to leaf and cane rust. The strobilurins and the frac-3s work really well. But you can't cure an infected plant. So again, this pathogen goes systemic. What it means by systemic is that it's just not going to have sporulation on the outside of the plant. It's inside the plant. Unfortunately, all fungicides that we have are not truly systemic fungicides. You may refer to them or hear them referred to as systemic, but really what's happening with those DMIs, with those strobilurins, is that they have locally systemic activity. That means basically a lot of them have translaminar activity, where if you spray it on one side of the leaf, the fungicide could travel through the mesophyll to the other side of the leaf there. Okay, but you're not going to get movement through the xylem or the phloem with those quote-unquote systemic fungicides. And so if I saw, a plant with orange rust, again, I would definitely remove the plant on a non-windy, non-rainy day. I would row the plants immediately adjacent. And then I would also probably before removing the plant, I would go ahead and actually protect protect my other plants that don't have symptoms around it with the DMI fungicide or a strobilurin fungicide. And that will go ahead and help prevent further infections within that block. Okay. Late rust is another, and again, we're starting to grow more raspberries here, some of Courtney Weber's selections. Um, but late rust is an issue in raspberries and purple raspberries. I haven't had to deal with it much here in North Carolina. I will say that the symptoms and signs come in usually around July here in the southeast to south central. Um, if they are growing raspberries, what I'd say is that this is not a major pain in the butt to manage. It's just something that, hey, it's just something to be cognizant of. And if you have a good spray program that includes a FRAC 3 or a FRAC 11, you're going to go ahead and get pretty reasonable control there. So it's just something else just to keep in mind there. And these can be often confused with each other. And I've seen them look very, very similarly. The only other thing I'll say with late rust is that white spruce can be an alternate control, or this pathogen can overwinter in diseased leaves that are on the ground or in buds. So just kind of keep an awareness of those two. Fungicides that will control cane and leaf rust will also control late rust, I would say, but you should be starting your programs much earlier for cane and leaf rust to get that initial inoculum. Okay. I couldn't get through an extension talk without talking about botrytis fruit rot. And so again, raspberries are much more susceptible to botrytis than most of our blackberry varieties or cultivars. Okay, but people would laugh at me, particularly here or out east where it's a much more humid growing environment, and particularly in the southeast where we get long periods of leaf wetting, high humidity, high temperatures. And so, you know, but really when we think about what causes disease and the conditions needed, it really should be a fairly rare event for these conditions to come together. And so the first, what you need is a susceptible host. Okay, so think about if you get the norovirus. Okay, you don't give that to your dog. I don't know of many dogs that have caught the norovirus from their owners there. Okay, and the same thing here. You have to have a susceptible host. So if you think of something like, let's say, Fusarium wilton blackberry, which if I have got time, I'll quickly mention today. Okay, that's very specific, that pathogen that causes it to blackberry. Okay, with botrytis, it's much more of a cosmopolitan pathogen where it can infect weeds. It can infect it's a necrotroph. It infects a lot of dead tissue and a lot of different crops and plants. Okay, so it's fairly ubiquitous in the environment. You also need to think about the biology and the availability of the pathogen. Is your host susceptible? Is it in the right growth stage, at the right phenology for when this pathogen is actually sporulating from its overwintering source? Okay, where that primary inoculum would hit. And then again, you need that conducive environment. Okay, think about your athlete's foot. Okay, in the the yeast that are associated with that, and the fungi that are associated with that, right? So with something along those lines, certainly it likes dark, moist, and kind of cozy conditions there. Here in the southeast, when I go to spray with a backpack sprayer, it is often still wet from 11 a.m. or noon. So that's something we need to keep in mind, is that our conditions here in North Carolina were very different than they were in the Finger Lakes, where often the grass was dry by, I would say, 10 a.m., 9 a.m., 8 a.m. by the time I'd get to work to spray. And now I just bring in multiple pairs of socks a day to get through the workday here. So that extended leaf wetting, those extended leaf wetting hours certainly create more of a conducive environment to something like botrytis. Okay. So again, when we talk about susceptibility, you don't just need the host that's susceptible, let's say an apple or a blackberry or a blueberry. Like I mentioned, it also needs to be at the correct phenology. And so, there was a study done in 2015 and 2016 in blackberry, just looking at the different phenology stages, their susceptibility to botrytis. And really what we're seeing here is that it's not until, let's say, bloom that plants start to become susceptible. And from there on, that susceptibility is going to increase as the fruit develops and particularly once it becomes mature. So what I tell growers is to manage botrytis both at bloom is a good focal point, and then manage it again at that pre-harvest to harvest interval. Okay, so if I inoculated that at the closed bud there, we wouldn't get any disease. But if I inoculated that mature fruit with botrytis, we'd have a field day. Okay, so the pathogen, like many other pathogens, can overwinter in infected floricanes and cankers right there. Or it can come in from other sources in the field. Okay, these little canidiaphores start to form on the canes. Okay, also on just crappy leaf litter that's sitting there from the previous season. All right, if you haven't gone out and cleaned up your trash, which is all really important for a lot of foliar diseases or cane diseases, you're gonna have a problem necessarily. And then fruit mummies as well. So when botrytis colonizes the fruit, it's going to shrivel up and form these fruit mummies that can either be left in the plant or on the ground. Okay, but if conditions are good, or you've got some windy conditions, or you get rain, all of these spores, these canidia that are hanging out on all of this leaf litter and dead material are going to bounce up and start to infect your blossoms. All right, and that blossom confection can then lead to infection of the fruit, or your fruit can just get infected itself, either way. Okay, and that cycle will continue. All right, so again, how are we going to manage botrytis? This is particularly important with raspberries, is I like cleaning up my trash. Get rid of cane lesions if you see them, but just get canes and leaves and mummies out of the field if possible. In apple, we like to chop up the leaf litter. I don't know. Here's my spray sheet, but I'm always reminded of. I'm not going to get politically here, but one of the State of the Unions during Trump's first State of the Union, if I recall, Nancy Pelosi did this, and she ripped up his speech. All right, and with this, we went ahead and we had 4 surface areas of, let's say, that paper to, let's say in this case, 4 times 4 times, or 4, 4, 4, we've got 12 surface areas. And so what's happening here when you flail mow, that's allowing microbes that are hanging out, beneficial microbes, to come on in and start chomping on that leaf litter. And having more surface area certainly goes ahead and allows easier access for those beneficial bacteria. In apples, we like to spray urea. Some of the growers here are doing this, but whereas in apple, we don't see too much compromise when it comes to cold hardiness. Sometimes urea can actually spark growth if it's gone ahead and applied in the fall in blackberries. But what urea does, accompanied with this flail mowing, is that urea, when applied on a day that's about 50 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer, that can also start to stimulate microbes and allow increased microbial populations, not bad microbes, good microbes, saprophytes, that can start to go ahead and break down that leaf litter there. Certainly opening up the canopy to reduce moisture and humidity is one of those. We've been playing around with prohexadione calcium with Tom Kahn, a plant growth regulator. With botrytis, we do have a number of chemicals that are registered, fungicides that are registered, but unfortunately, there is a lot of resistance associated with botrytis, multiple fungicide resistance. And so, this is kind of in part that's really near and dear to my heart. And why am I putting this picture of this old guy now unfortunately dead? Doc Godfrey up here, is because I got to meet him by presenting an award, an outstanding alumni award at Cornell. And Doc graduated from Cornell and then he was co-founder of AgChem Service Corps. So think of something like Helena or Nutrient, which not only serves as an ag distributor, but also is really serves alongside Extension in more consultation roles there. But, if you think about Doc started in 1967 when he founded AgChem. And during this time, this was really what I would call sort of the heightened, the birth of some of these more locally systemic single-site fungicides. So prior to this, Captan, Mancozeb, and some of the inorganics like copper were really what growers were utilizing for disease management. And, when as they were utilizing these had to be applied for protective purposes only. And so, in this situation here, with these single site fungicides, growers started to adopt more IPM practices that were meant for entomology or arthropod management. And so they were able to spray after an infection event. They were using lower doses. They were spraying alternate rows and extending their spray intervals. And so Doc got a phone call one day from apple growers throughout the region, and they had been utilizing dodine and applying it up to 96 hours post-infection for apple scab. And he got 2 or 3 calls one morning, or fairly early in the spring, and growers were reporting large outbreaks of apple scab on their trees, and this hadn't happened in years since growers were predominantly using dodine instead of these multi-site fungicides. And it turns out that there was widespread resistance to dodine. And then Carrick and I, when I started with Carrick, we went back out and collected apple scab populations from apple leaves, right? And the Venturion equalis, the fungus. And dodine hadn't been used for years, but what we did is we took these lesions back to the lab and tested these in vitro for fungicide sensitivity. Really what we found here is that this resistance was quite stable. So it's something that we need to keep in mind, that once we lose a fungicide, it doesn't come back. And I've got 2 more quick slides here, and then I'll be done. I don't have time to do viruses today, but I'm happy to chat about those in any other time here. But I will say that with botrytis fruit rot, with botrytis as a pathogen, it has a number of cycles per year or per season. And because of that, resistance is selected for at a much greater rate, okay, in that sense. And so what we find here is that, with botrytis populations tend to have multiple fungicide resistance. It doesn't mean cross resistance, that if I'm resistant to one fungicide within a frac group, I'm going to be resistant to another. What we're seeing is multiple resistance across numbers of frac groups. Okay, and like Kelly said before, I don't just like they're not seeing many new insecticides coming out. The fungicide market's really grim too as far as conventional fungicides go. Okay, so something to keep in mind there. And with IR4, we looked at some biopesticides for botrytis control and management. And I found this really promising. We did test in both Ponca and Crimson Treasure. Ponca is much less susceptible to botrytis than Crimson Treasure. As you can see here by our untreated programs, we only had 40% incidence of botrytis, whereas with Crimson Treasure raspberries, we had 90%. And switch in both raspberries and blackberries was our grower conventional standard. But we looked at a number of time oils, Fun Time Trail and Mevalone in both systems, and we did see, that Fun Time statistically provided a similar level of control as our conventional fungicide. So did Mevalone. And then Howler, which now is manufactured by Certus. It's a Pseudomonad biocontrol. This again really reduced, particularly botrytis incident, particularly in symptoms or in blackberries where disease incidence wasn't so high. But you can even see here that in raspberries it performed even better. This should be a D, sorry, not a C there. But it performed even better than the conventional fungicide by itself. And so with that, just for time's sake, I'm not going to have time to talk about blackberry decline today, which I figured because I like to talk a lot, but I'm happy to take any questions about decline or viruses or anything else during the group session here.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
I was happy to see those IR4 results.
I have a thank you slide with IR4 also, but it was after the other. So yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. It's awesome when everyone's so passionate that they just can go on and on about these things.
Oh, it just kind of comes out. I don't practice. That's the problem.
Well, yeah, thank you, everyone. So I'm going to ask all the panelists to come back on here if you're here, and we can open this up to discussion. While you guys are getting on, I'm just going to share this slide. Where is it? Yes. This is for the pesticide credits. If you've stayed on, thank you very much. And you should be seeing that. Yeah, those are the credits, the course, and make sure to complete the attendance verification form that should be in the chat. We'll resend that. And then we also have a grower survey if you are someone that is growing caneberries or interested in growing caneberries, we'd love to hear from you and your interest in participating in an integrated pest management program or just what pests and diseases are you seeing? We'd love to hear more so we can invite more specialists and focus on those areas. So I was glad to hear about the rust, particularly the orange rust, because that's been a big issue. Um, so we did have one question come in from Sam. Are you seeing much raspberry cane blight, and how are you treating for that?
So, is raspberry cane blight caused by the same pathogen as blackberry cane blight, leptosphaeria, or are you talking more about spur blight issues?
I don't know if Sam can unmute
Okay.
himself.
Well, let's go through all of that, okay? Let's just go
Okay.
ahead. So yeah, I was going to talk about cane blight in general,
Yeah, you can
as
start
far as
video.
that goes. And so we do see a bit of cane blight here in the southeast, but it's not necessarily caused by leptosphaeria, the traditional pathogen that causes cane blight, I would say, in these systems. And so, very similar to Jonathan Oliver, we're seeing Botrosphaeria or Phomopsis. We've seen Neopestalotiopsis, a strain that caused some considerable damage there, and so forth. But we've also seen spur blight, which is caused by Didymella. Okay, and we've predominantly seen that in some of Courtney's blackberries here, as well as some ponca that were adjacent to those blackberries. What I would say in that case is, definitely getting on a delayed dormant lime sulfur and hitting that timing just as you might be starting to see green tissue, if not right before, is going to be really important. And good coverage with that lime sulfur is going to be really, really important. It's also going to be vital to protect those pruning wounds, and I'm not sure how you're doing that. So what I like to say is, particularly on blackberry, if you're cane tipping in the summertime, your primocanes, I mean, I like to do the pinching technique not to leave too big of a wound. If you are leaving a bigger wound because you don't have time to pinch and you get to it late, certainly Pristine is a good fungicide to put out there combined with Captan. Switch is another good one, but I really like to focus on those Frac 11s with Captan to protect those pruning wounds. If you see quite a bit of winter damage, those also can create micro cracks where some of these pathogens can invade as well. And so that's really where we're seeing quite a bit of damage with that. But yeah, getting rid of those fluorocanes, scouting the primocanes as usual. But for sure, trying to eliminate stress and protecting those wounds are going to be two big areas.
Okay. All right, thank you. And I want to go back to one more question that we had before about insect pest monitoring. There was a question about monitoring for SWD, stink bugs. What are the best recommendations for how to monitor for those? Are those pheromones? Are there sticky traps? I don't know if you want to take that, Kelly.
Sure. So I did put in the chat also, for spotted-wing Drosophila, we don't have a pheromone lure, so Drosophila flies only have close-range pheromones. So we usually are taking advantage of long-range pheromones with other insects for using those pheromones to lure. Instead, we have food-based lures. You can buy commercial ones. You can make your own. I don't typically recommend using those adult traps in caneberries because I don't find them that informative. For things like cherries and blueberries that have a little bit less pressure and also are earlier in the season where some years you're going to have pressure and some years you're not, it's very helpful to know if spotted wing is active in the crop. But for raspberries and blackberries, they really love raspberries and blackberries. They will find them. And also by the time they start fruiting, when they become susceptible, there will be spotted wing. And the later in the season it is, the worse it is. So I don't think I don't think it's a good use of your time per se. So I typically recommend, if you want to know if it's detectable by your consumers, if you want to know if I tend to look for the larvae in the fruit for that one.
Mm-hmm.
For brown marmorated stink bug, it's just one of a whole complex of stink bugs that may be feeding in your crop. So again, that one I would scout visually for stink bugs generally, and I tend to manage them also as a complex of species rather than just one species.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yep, you'll know that through taste test too, if you got a stink bug problem. But that's probably not the best way. Okay, thank you. We have a question from Brad Burke here. Are there any, and this is another disease question, are there any truly orange rust resistant varieties of thornless blackberries? Most of the Arkansas varieties are not.
Wow. Are you seeing that much rust on the only few that we've seen it on here on Thornless of the Arkansas is Ponca, Navajo, but we really haven't seen it, which is
Hmm.
interesting because I'm starting to be concerned that there might be different strains of orange rust, to be quite honest with you. And so I don't know, Janine. I should take it. Like, that would be a fun little survey there to go ahead and compare some of the rust we're seeing here and do, maybe a dual variety trial with something like that with our different rust pathogens, our different rust strains. I think that might actually be warranted because my friend Hannah next door to me here, who is Tom Kahn's research assistant and an employee degree graduate student. She was out at a grower's yesterday, and again we saw ponca. I haven't seen it as explosive on ponca, where we've removed the plant that had it, and it hasn't spread throughout the field. But that's really interesting.
Okay.
Are you guys growing much Vaughn in New Jersey?
Vaughn.
Vaughn. It's an NC State released Gina Fernandez. Um, I really like Vaughn because it's really cold hardy. And I don't see too much. It's better in cooler it's been better for us here in the mountains in many ways than some of the Arkansas varieties when we have a really ugly winter, as far as cold hardiness goes and cane diseases go.
Okay.
So I'd be curious to see if something like that even would have orange rust. And Gina just released Irvin. So it's Vaughn, VON, and then Irvin has Vaughn as a parent. But that would be another interesting one to take a look at. Again, it's a bit more cold hardy, really good berry, I think, and just for us here has stood the test of time so
Okay.
far.
Cool. And
So
those are thornless.
they are, and they are also highly fusarium tolerant. So I didn't get a chance to talk about fusarium. I don't think you guys have that problem yet, which is why it was okay to skip it. But
Yeah.
in our trials so far, we've not seen any fusarium on Vaughn, and so or on Irvin.
Okay. Yeah,
So those
that's
are
great.
two considerations for you guys. But it might be
Yeah.
an interesting little trial there to do that with our strains of orange rust versus what we're finding on Ponca, which versus what you guys are seeing, and maybe plan a variety trial or something at both locations.
Okay. Well, we have a new fruit pathologist
Pathologist,
here at
yeah, that'll be
Rutgers,
fun.
Nancy Sharma. So,
Yeah,
Nancy, if you're hearing that, reach out to Sarah.
yeah, we should do that. Yeah, yeah. I'm sure we can get Arkansas to play ball, and then we can get these plants donated, hopefully. So,
Okay,
okay,
great.
cool.
All right. Okay, well, so we're coming up on just a final couple minutes here. Are there any other questions? Open forum here, please post them and we can talk about them. Um, and if not, I'll give it one more minute. I have a question. But I was very happy to hear you say very um, defiantly, Sarah, that these plants with orange rust need to be removed because we hear a lot from our growers that they'll put these products out with the orange rust, it goes away and they don't want to remove the plants. But I think based off of what you're saying,
I mean,
that this
and
is
it,
just a problem that's going to keep coming
I
back
remove
and
it.
spread.
Yeah. And I would say if you're a homeowner, you might be able to just play along for a little bit, but it really makes me nervous to have several blackberry plants. That, if you're a commercial grower and this is part of your livelihood, to have something like that happen.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Not seeing any other questions. Thank you guys for going along with this format here, adding you to join as panelists and attendees. And anyway, I would love to make this a larger series. I feel like I didn't give any of you enough time to delve into a lot of information, but you did fantastic with the time that you had. So I really appreciate it.
Well, interesting. Like, there's been grumblings of maybe we want to do an SERI at some point, Janine, for modernization of caneberry production, and you know, east in the eastern part of not the West Coast. And so that'd be really interesting to maybe get our brains together here with some of this, and this could be part of it.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, we will, yeah, if you are able to, if you're a grower and are able to participate in this survey and just give us an idea of what you're doing out there in New Jersey, that would be awesome. And if we can continue to build on an IPM program, everyone talks about IPM here, it was fantastic. We'll be sharing the link for the webinar here that is recorded. And I appreciate everyone. I know it's beautiful, albeit a little bit cold. Hopefully everyone makes it through another cold night here. But yeah, let's continue this discussion. Please reach out to all these wonderful experienced people. And with that, yeah, I will let you get back to your day. And thank you everyone for attending and participating. Okay, goodbye, guys.